right, so let's take a look at this massive chart that we see here. So what is this chart? This chart gives us the z-scores. If you remember, we only need to consider primarily z-scores between -3 and 3. And if you notice, this chart gives us a z-score, and then it gives us an area beneath the curve, okay? So there's going to be some things that I want you to notice about this. First of all, the area beneath the curve is the area from the mean, yes, it's the area from the mean to the data value. So let me give you an idea of what we're talking about here. If you remember, the z-score of the mean is 0. So for instance, if I said I had a z-score of 1.2, what this chart is giving me is the area between the mean and 1.2. Okay? So what would I do if I had 1.2? Well, I'd look for a z-score of 1.2, and it tells me the area as a decimal, what it is as a decimal, of that shaded region right there. So what it would be telling me is that 38.5%, which is 0.385, were between the mean and the z-score of 1.2. So if I wanted to know how many scored below this, I would have to add in the 50% from here, plus the chart value of the 38.5. So if you want to know how many lie below this z-score, and your z-score is positive, you're going to do, so if you want to know below, let me write this down, sorry. If you want to know below, how many scored below this z-score, and this z-score is positive, you're always going to do the chart value plus 50%. Okay? If you wanted to know how many score below, above it, which would be this region right here, think about how we could get that pink region right there. Well, you would take the 50%, the 38.5%, and you would subtract that from 100. So if I do 50 plus 38.5, 50 plus 38.5, I'm getting 88.5, and then I'm doing 100 minus 88.5, and I'm getting 11.5%. So what's an easier way of getting that 11.5%? If I want to know how many score above the z-score, and this is a positive z-score, then I'm going to do 0.50% minus the chart value. Okay, so below a z-score and above a z-score right there was going to be 50% minus the chart value. So if you notice, there's always two columns. There's the z-score, and then there's the area between the curve. Again, that area is the red shaded region that they're giving you. So if you look, every single one of their z-scores is rounded to 2 decimals. Every single one of their areas is rounded to 3 decimals. These are estimations. If you notice our z-scores, it goes above a 3 for a z-score. There are those tail endings, but look at every single one of those values for the area above a z-score of 3. They're virtually identical at 0.499, all the way down to the end when you have a z-score of 3.3. You're essentially half of the data. Mathematically, to 3 decimal places, you're half of the data. Okay, so you find a z-score, you use the chart value, and then you think about this. If it's a positive z-score and you want to know below it, you're going to do the chart value plus 50%. If it's a positive z-score and you want to know above it, you do 50% minus the chart value. Okay, now I have a question. Where the heck are the negative z-scores here? What would it be if you had a negative z-score? Well, the answer is, if you remember, a normal curve is symmetric. So it's the exact same area above the curve as below the curve. So if I had a z-score of 1.2, that area is the same as if I had a z-score of negative 1.2. But we need to be able to visualize what happens if I have a negative z-score. So I'm going to pick a different z-score. Instead of 1.2, I'm going to use a different number. How about if we had a z-score of negative... how about negative, let's look at a z-score of negative, how about, I don't know, 1.5, okay? So if I used a z-score of negative 1.5, what would I do? Well, I would use a z-score of 1.5, because it's symmetric, it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, and I see the area of 0.433. I need to understand what that area represents though. So if I took a normal curve, here's my mean with a z-score of 0, negative 1.5 would be somewhere over here. What are they giving me now? They're giving me the area between the z-score and the mean. This is always giving me the area between the z-score and the mean. So let's use that chart value right here. It's telling me that 43.3% lie between that chart value and the mean, okay? So now let's think about it. What if I wanted below, how many scored below a z-score of negative 1.5? So if my z-score here is negative, very important that you note that your z-score is negative here, how would I find, I'm going to color it pink here, how would I find that pink area over there? Well, I know all the way to 0 is 50%, so I'm going to do 50% minus the chart value. If I do 50% minus the chart value, in this case it would be 50 minus 43.3, that would give me my 6.7% would be right there. And if I wanted to know how many scored above a z-score of negative 1.2, again, here's a z-score given to me, and the z-score is negative, what would I do? Well, if I wanted to find the amount above, remember this area over here is 50%, and that 43.3% was the chart value. So how would I find the amount that scored above with a z-score that was negative? I would take the chart value, and I would add to it 50%. Okay, so that would be the total in this one would be, what would that be? 93.3% scored above the score of a z-score that has a z-score of negative 1.5. So it is different for the two of these. You have two different cases that you need to consider. The first case being, what if your z-score is positive? The second case being, what is your z-score is negative? If your z-score is positive, to find those below, you do the chart value plus 50%. If your z-score is positive and you want to know how many above, you do 50% minus the chart value. If your z-score is negative and you want to know how many scored below, you do 50% minus the chart value. And if your z-score is negative and you want to do above, you do the chart value plus 50%. So it's very important that you know those two things right there. We're also going to do how many scored between two numbers. Well, that is going to be taking the two chart values and subtracting them. But we'll look at that later, okay? So I just wanted to give you an idea of how do you read the chart, how are you going to answer some of the questions. Always start by finding the z-score. From the z-score you get the area, you get the chart value, which is the area, and then you're going to analyze which one of these cases is it. Is my z-score positive or negative? Do I want above or below? Okay?